Could a man be swallowed by a great fish, or a whale for that matter, and live to tell the tale? Find out next on the Prophetic Connection. This place, the Mount of Olives. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when the Messiah. Behind me, the modern and ancient entrance to the harbor at Joppa, a seaport on the coast of Israel. In the distance, the tall hotels of Tel Aviv, which in fact grew out of this place on the coast of Israel. Tel Aviv is barely more than 100 years old, but the history of Joppa goes back more than 3,000 years. 3,000 years ago, King Hiram of Tyre donated cypress and cedar logs to Solomon, the king of Israel, who was building a temple and palaces at Jerusalem. And they had this agreement, a trade agreement, 3,000 years ago. And those logs were floated down the coast on platforms, taken off here and transported up to the mountains of Jerusalem. But Joppa is mentioned in the Bible in several places. One prophet ran from God and he came here. And here he boarded a ship going in the opposite direction of where God wanted him to go. His name was Jonah. And as the story unfolds in the book of Jonah in the Old Testament, a storm at sea causes the sailors to wonder what's gone wrong. Jonah tells them he's the problem, he's running from God. So they throw him overboard, but God has prepared a great fish. And the fish swallows Jonah, and for 3 days and 3 nights, he's in the belly of the fish, until God speaks to the fish and it vomits him up on dry land. And God gives him a second chance, and he goes and preaches to Nineveh, a wicked, violent city. And the whole city is transformed by the preaching of God's word coming through Jonah. But is that all there is to that story? Or is there another prophetic connection to it? I believe there is, and it's found in the New Testament on the lips of Jesus.
Jonah is one of the Bible's shortest prophetic books, yet it was significant to Jesus and has inspired and entertained millions around the world throughout the centuries. The book of Jonah is very unique. While other prophetic books in the Bible are focused primarily on Israel and Judah, Jonah's story revolves around a non-Jewish city outside of the Promised Land. And while for the most part, all other prophets of Israel are obedient to God in delivering the messages they received, Jonah is much less eager, to say the least.
Jonah, of course, as a historical figure, has always been one which has captured the imagination of many, mainly because, of course, as depicted in paintings in the Middle Ages or otherwise, the experience that he had with his great fish. It's not quite certain whether it was a fish or a whale. In modern parlance, we talk about Jonah and the whale. It seems likely that it may not have been an actual whale, but that's, I suppose, not as relevant for our discussion. But what's interesting to me is that's always kind of the focus of most people's understanding. You say Jonah, they think of the whale. Because whether as a children's story or as paintings, as I say, that's kind of been the main focus of most observers over the years. The story of Jonah, I think, is even more provocative than that. One of the fascinating aspects of the story of Jonah is his attempt to run away.
Upon hearing God's voice telling him to take a prophetic message eastward toward the city of Nineveh, Jonah heads in the opposite direction, toward the Mediterranean Sea.
He's sent to Nineveh to give a prophecy about the destruction of the city, and one of the reasons he's reluctant to go is he knows, because he's a prophet, that the Ninevians are going to listen. And they do, in fact. I mean, there's two explanations. One is that he's afraid, since bad prophecy is a warning that can be avoided and good prophecy is always guaranteed to happen, he's going to prophesy destruction, it's not going to happen, he'll be accused of being a false prophet. Although if the people repented, it doesn't have to happen. And one of his major concerns and his reluctance to go is that it's going to make the Jewish people look really bad. He's going to go to the Ninevians. He's going to walk through the city, which is so big it takes 3 days to walk through, saying that God's going to overthrow the city and they're going to listen. Meanwhile, he's spent his whole prophetic career screaming at the Jewish people and they're not going to listen. Why are they listening and the children of God not listening?
His was not, I'm running away because I'm frightened of God. It was a running away of saying, I just don't want to deal with this, which is a fascinating and very human response to the kind of challenges that many of us faced, let alone the challenge he was faced, which was basically a request by God to go to Nineveh and talk to the people and tell them to get their act together.
Instead of going to Nineveh, Jonah headed to Joppa, and from there boarded a ship to Tarshish, a western seaport in what is now modern Spain. But God caught up with Jonah at sea, sending a mighty tempest that caused the crew and passengers to call upon their gods and cast lots concerning who might be responsible for the storm.
When the penny drops and he realizes he can't run away, he's tried, he thought maybe getting on a boat and going out into the Mediterranean might help, is that he does a very moral, ethical, phenomenal thing of saying to the people on the boat, look, you're all in trouble because of me. Throw me over and you'll be fine. And equally fascinating is that they refuse. Because again, in that society, that would make sense. Okay, that's the solution? That's great. Listen, sorry about this, but we're throwing you overboard because clearly that's going to work. And funny thing is, they don't even question that. They actually accept that that's possible, but they do the moral thing to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to try and find a different solution.
The crew attempted to row Jonah toward the closest shore, but the sea grew more and more angry. At last, they relented and threw Jonah into the sea. Once the raging waves had successfully consumed Jonah, the sea became calm. Then the Bible tells us an intriguing and unbelievable account occurred. God sent a great fish to swallow Jonah, and he remained in the belly of that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. The question is, could this event really have occurred?
The Jewish understanding is God generally puts laws into place in nature that he doesn't like to uproot. But then again, occasionally he does it to demonstrate that there is nothing besides him. Ein od milvado. There's nothing besides God, and the laws of nature are just put in place by the creator of the universe, and he has the free will, because he's God, to violate any laws of nature, like the plagues in Egypt, when you have hail that's on fire, darkness that you can't move through. So the most rigorous answer to miracles, bottom line, is God can do whatever he likes. That is actually, in my opinion, the most scientific, intellectually honest, philosophically correct answer. An infinite being that creates the entire physical universe can choose to do, obviously, no matter how big a fish is, even if a blue whale swallows a human being, they ain't gonna survive very long in his stomach. So obviously this is meant to be something that's quite supernatural. Even if you want to take it literally, God can make a big fish that can swallow you and you end up in a living room with a light and a chandelier and, and a lounge chair. If he wants to do it, he can do it. We tend to be hyper rational and not like these things, but the bottom line is that if you think of the physical world that we live in, it's all miraculous. We just get used to the laws of nature and think that it's, sure, rain we can explain. The creation of the universe, that's pretty unbelievable.
After a few days in the belly of the fish, God commanded it to vomit Jonah onto dry land and gave Jonah a second chance to deliver his message to Nineveh. This time he obeyed. Upon hearing Jonah's warning that their city would be destroyed in 40 days, Nineveh repented, and God began to change his plans for the city. This made Jonah very angry with God. In utter depression, Jonah sat on the east side of Nineveh to watch what might become of it. As he sat there, God caused a plant to grow and provide Jonah with shade.
A flower grows in one day, like it comes out of the ground, it grows this beautiful flowering fruit, and it gives him much joy, and then this hot wind blows, and he's lying, he wants to melt, and he's dehydrating, then a worm comes and eats it, and it dies. And he's all depressed that his fruit died. And then God says to him, he says, you're depressed about this. Meanwhile, you got this whole city of Nineveh, it's got like thousands of people in it, they don't know anything, they're all a bunch of morally blind people, and there you're not upset about it. This is about the fruit. But that's a very powerful message about getting your priorities straight.
Although the book of Jonah ends with God's rebuke for Jonah's misplaced priorities, for Jesus, Jonah's story of disobedience would be a profound prophetic sign of salvation.
prophet Jonah had a very specific call on his life. And God gave him one particular assignment. He was to go to the Gentile city called Nineveh and to preach God's word there and to warn the inhabitants that they had 40 days basically to clean up their act or suffer the consequences God would bring upon them. But that was an assignment Jonah didn't want to take. Nineveh was one of the most wicked and violent cities on earth in Jonah's day. So he went in the opposite direction. But listen to how the prophet Nahum describes Nineveh. In chapter 3 of Nahum verse 1 to 4. Woe to the bloody city! It is full of lies and robbery. Its victim never departs. The noise of a whip and the noise of rattling wheels, of galloping horses, of clattering chariots, horsemen charged with bright sword and glittering spear. There is a multitude of slain, a great number of bodies, countless corpses. They stumble over the corpses because of the multitude of harlotries of the seductive harlot, meaning this city called Nineveh, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations through her harlotries and families through her sorceries. So this was the assignment that God gave Jonah. And Nineveh was the last place on earth, seemingly, that he wanted to go to. Nineveh was northeast of Israel, so Jonah went west to the harbor behind me in the seaport of Joppa. And there he boarded a ship any ship would have done, as long as it took him far from the coasts of Israel and far away from here and in the opposite direction of Nineveh. But remember, he was God's prophet, and he had this specific call on his life. So God pursued him out into the Mediterranean Sea. And God caused a great storm to come up so that the ship was in danger of sinking. And the other mariners, the other sailors, wondering what the problem was, they saw it as there was a reason for this. Anyway, as the story unfolds, Jonah explains to them that he's the problem. He's a prophet running from God. And he tells them to throw him overboard, and they don't want to do that. But eventually they give in, and in so many words, they ask for God's forgiveness, even as they throw his prophet over the side of the ship. Well, as the story unfolds in the book of Jonah, God has prepared a great fish. Some people speak of it as being a whale, but the Bible specifically refers to it, in the translation at least, as a fish. In Jonah chapter 1, in verse 17, now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And it's interesting because we could pick out at least 2 prayers that he expresses here. In chapter 2, in verse 1, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly, and he said, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. But then in this verse, it also says, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Sheol is the Hebrew word that speaks of the world of departed spirits. And of course, in our Christian understanding, when we die, our spirit, that God-breathed part of us, leaves our bodies, and hopefully it ascends into heaven. But according to Christian theology, the spirit does not stay in the body once death has taken place. So Jonah tells us he's praying out of the belly of Sheol, the place of departed spirits. And as you read the words that unfold in chapter 2 of Jonah, he's actually praying the Psalms, the book of Psalms that were written so hundreds of years earlier, and he cries out to God. And then we're told in chapter 2 and verse 10, so the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. And then we read in chapter 3 opens with these words, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. He's given a second chance. And we believe in a God who gives second chances because he's a loving God of grace. So the prophet Jonah, having run from God, has another opportunity to obey God this time and do as God commanded him to do. In verse 2 of chapter 3, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city, a 3-day journey in extent. And that might simply refer to the metropolitan area, the wider countryside in which Nineveh was situated. And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. Then he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And then, to his amazing surprise, so the people of Nineveh believed God. Remember, this is a wicked, violent city, but with the preaching of God's prophet, they now believe. And it says in verse 5 in chapter 3, so the people of Nineveh believed God, proclaimed a fast, and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. Then the word came to the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, laid aside his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes, and he caused it to be proclaimed and published throughout Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, "Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water. But let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and cry mightily to God. Yes, let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who can tell if God will turn and relent and turn away from his fierce anger, so that we may not perish?" Verse 10 of chapter 3, then God saw their works. He saw their humility, their repentance, in other words, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Now, this is every preacher's dream. It's every prophet's dream, that people would respond to the preaching of his message. And imagine that this whole city, from the king all the way down to the lowest subjects, repents before God and seeks forgiveness and receives it. Jonah should have been jumping for joy, but he's not. And chapter 4 opens with these words, "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, 'Ah, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish. For I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live.'" Now he's despondent because the city has responded, and we find the real reason he fled from God in the first place. It isn't only that it was a violent city, it is that he didn't want God's love and grace to be poured out upon a Gentile city, which he despised, and who in turn probably despised him and everything that was part of Israel. And now he's despondent. He wants to die. Instead of being full of joy, he's full of sadness and displeasure, and in fact, angry. Now that's the story of Jonah, and we could probably say we could leave it there, except for something that happens in the ministry of Jesus that's found in Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 38. "Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, 'Teacher, we want to see a sign from you.' But he answered and said to them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah.' And listen to these words. 'For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man,'" meaning himself, "'be 3 days and 3 nights on the heart of the earth.'" And then this rebuke of the religious elite, the Pharisees, the scribes of Jesus' day. Verse 41 of Matthew 12, "The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here," meaning himself. "The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here," meaning himself. The queen of the south, we believe, refers to the Queen of Sheba, who came from northeast Africa and traveled all the way to Israel. She had heard of the wisdom and the fame and the grandeur brought about under Solomon's reign. She wanted to see for herself. So she travels all the way from Africa And today we would say that Sheba was probably in the vicinity of Ethiopia, Eritrea, that part of Africa. She traveled a long way with a great entourage, bringing gold and spices and all manner of gifts for Solomon to see if it was true what she had heard about him. And when she sees that it is true, she declares that Solomon's God is a great God, and in fact she blesses the God of Israel. So what is Jesus saying in his answer to the scribes and the Pharisees when they ask him for a sign? Remember, he's doing signs all over the place. He's feeding multitudes. He's opening blind eyes. He's helping the paralyzed to walk. Are those signs not enough? They want something more from him, and so they ask for a sign, and he says to them, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of the prophet Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so I, the Son of Man, will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, meaning before his resurrection. And he draws a direct parallel with Jonah. And is the parallel so direct that in fact when Jonah was in the belly of the fish, it's not that a man could be swallowed by a great fish and live to tell the tale. It is that Jonah could have died, and probably died, which is why his spirit was in the place of departed spirits, in Sheol. And from there he cried out to God. And if that's the case, then he simply didn't survive being in the belly of the fish. He was resurrected from death, precisely as Jesus was. And so the sign of Jonah is this direct parallel. So what do we do with the story of Jonah? Is it simply an allegory, a parable full of symbolism that is not to be taken literally? Or was it in fact an event that really occurred? Because it's on the same level as the story of Jesus. What do we do with that story? Do we believe that he died and rose again? Each of us must decide for himself, herself. But it happened here at Joppa, where the prophet, having gone out into sea on a ship, was swallowed by a great fish, and according to the Bible, lived to tell the tale. And Jesus lifted this story up, made it part of his own teaching. He made the prophetic connection. Behind me, the blue waters of the Mediterranean, where its waves kiss the shores of Israel, of the Holy Land. This is also the setting for the story of Jonah, where he sailed on a ship bound for Tarshish, which some would suggest was Spain, as far away from Israel as he could get. But God pursued him. Don't you like to think that God would pursue the likes of us? Not only that, God gave him a second chance. And who among us doesn't need a second chance, even a third and fourth chance? Because we make mistakes daily. We speak out of turn, we inflict emotional wounds on other people, sometimes we receive them, and that builds resentment and sometimes hatred within us. And we need to believe in a God of second chances who forgives, a God of amazing grace, as the old hymn has it. God gave Jonah a second chance. And imagine the people who sailed here to the Holy Land, who have sailed here down through history, all of the empires, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the British Empire. They've all been here at one time or another, bringing men and women to these shores and taking men and women from these shores, sometimes even into exile. People everywhere needing second chances, needing to believe. We want the prophetic connection to go to the ends of the earth from Israel, because it's God's truth, it's God's biblical truth. And people need to hear that God, the God of all creation, is in fact a God of second chances.